I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very impressed with the work going on here, and I've also been very interested in this institution or K3 as a model. I mean, that's a long-standing interest of mine. I've also been interested in, and still interested in, this building as a kind of the discussion of the building too, the heated discussion sometimes, since I do work on knowledge production and space. And I'm also very interested in this particular space. I was just taking photos. I'm collecting photos from the presentation point of view from various venues, and the gradient here is special, interesting. It's also very exciting to be here at a time when the university is about to become a university. And the topic I'm going to talk about is something I'm grappling with, and I'm hoping you'll be able to help me. And I've been grappling with it for some time. This is a program from an important industry visit to Umeå University in 2000 as part of the fundraising campaign. And I was a very new director of HUMlab at the point, a situation where the humanities were asked to relate to university-wide collaboration with a major industry partner, which was a challenge and a situation that seemed to require a different mode of, or different modes of engagement and alignment, different from what had been used to in the department in English, the English department, English linguistics. And this was also part of a program, so it was one visit among many. So I tried hard to think about what Volvo Trucks might want from us. And I adapted my presentation accordingly. And I fairly soon learned that wasn't a very useful way to go about it. There's nothing wrong to consider the alignments with potential collaborators and funders. But I think what I did was that I adapted too much, and I tried to frame HUMlab as driven, which was the institution I represented, as driven by Volvo Truck needs, or Trucks needs, rather than, or rather my idea of what I thought Volvo Truck might need. So I gradually learned that it's important not to take away yourself when framing yourself. And also, I think what was most important to these industries was what they didn't do themselves, what they couldn't create themselves, and also the resistance and the challenge that we could offer. And that kind of work, I think, has to be dialogic and built on mutual respect and interest. And there is tension and consistent negotiation in such processes, and this can be very productive, I think, too, but also difficult and time-consuming. And you have to be willing to change, but also have integrity. And although I think we were successful to some degree, and this was very useful to both us and the university, I also think that we could have had a stronger part of actually negotiating the deals that was the result of this campaign. So it was fun and important. But I think there's a risk that the humanities, also in a context like this, become ornamental rather than core to the operation. And this wasn't, I think, the fault of the university. On the contrary, it was great to be invited to this and very useful for HUMlab. But I think we could have had a stronger idea about how to think about ourselves, how to instrumentalize ourselves for such, in the context of such collaboration. So over the years, we had many meetings of this kind and collaboration with industry. I'll just give you one more example. And this is not an institutional presentation I'm doing, but I'm using these initially as examples. So this is a meeting we had with the Swedish bank, Swedish National Bank, which was much more of a dialogue that was useful to everyone involved, I think. So the bank was thinking about the role of their space, talking about space again, their bank palaces, their bank offices, because they didn't, I mean, customers didn't use the bank in the same way anymore. They were removing the bills and later also the coins, and later also the bills. So what we did was that you can see it's kind of faint here, but one of our employees, Anna Meshirina, who's on the left here, who's an architect, she was in Russia at the time, was part of this discussion. Erica Robles-Anderson from NYU, was a former postdoc of the lab, was part of the discussion, and she talked about how her work on churches, Cristo Cathedral in Southern California, and their use of technology and the removal of the eventual removal of the physical Bible, which is somewhat equivalent, or you can contrast that to banks removing their coins and bills, and this discussion led to collaboration, but still, one challenge was to actually frame this in terms of what we would do together. So this is not. This is not a talk about industry collaboration, but I think there is a possibility for the humanities here to be involved in these process, and that we can also be part of actually setting the agenda and being a platform in which these and many other kinds of meetings can happen, and where there is also a space to negotiate how this is being done. As you may have noticed in this slide, there are only men here, and I cut away the delegation from Volvo Trucks because there were also men, but I didn't want to show their names. I think this was some time ago, but I'm sure that we wouldn't, or I wouldn't. This is not acceptable, and if you're the venue where this happened and you're part of it, you can also influence. And this is just one example of many structures you can relate to in work like this. So I think of this as a kind of curatorial role too, that can be active and agenda setting, as I said earlier, too. And I think the humanities are well placed to take on such a role, and we, all of the humanities, but not least what Sverker Selin and Anders Ekström call the integrative humanities, or integrative knowledge environments, relating to a whole set of humanities like urban, digital, environmental, medical humanities. And I'm also thinking of areas like queer, gender, disability, and race studies. So, and I also wanted to, before I continue, relate briefly to conversation. We had a research meeting in Stockholm yesterday, and one of the participants, Vendela Grundell, who's an art historian, talked about glitching and glitch art. And she made the point, which is when things don't work or when you challenge established structures. She made the point that glitch is about friction or problems, not just instrumental excitement or normalized experience. And I think similarly, the active and interventionist humanities need to engage cross-discipline platforms and outside the university in ways that are not always comfortable and easy. And such work can sometimes happen in what's been called contact zones by Marie-Louise Pratt, or trading zones, which is Peter Gallison's phrase. But whatever platforms, I think it's important that people come together for this kind of work in epistemically open environments, ideally supporting multiple modes of engagement. And that universities, not least, I think, through the humanities, can be platforms for important meetings and be part of dialogue and change, always with others, but with integrity. And I mean, this is an amazing school for that kind of work, I think, and location in Malmö too. And I also just want to say that initially that this is, I mean, the humanities are many things, not only one thing. I'm not, in talking about active humanities, I'm not saying that the humanities aren't active on the whole, and also I'm not disregarding or disrespecting conventional humanities. But there is a difference here, and it's one, if you think about it in terms of active or activity, there's an article by Lars-Erik Janlert and Kjell Jonsson a number of years ago in Tvärsnitt on the Kulturlaboratoriet, the Cultural Laboratory, where they write about the active manipulation-based making practices in the sciences, and how the humanities are often limited to observations and analyses. And my point here, my argument is that humanities are often resistant or somewhat resistant or unused to such active engagement. And when there is outward engagement, and we have a lot of that in the humanities, I think you could argue that the repertoire sometimes seems limited. And it's not on, this is a tweet, you don't have to read this whole thing. It's not only about the responsibility that Natalie Tjujemenko at NYU talks about in her environmental health clinic project, although this is important, but it's also about what we want the humanities to be and the roles we imagine for ourselves. If you don't know her work, it's really fantastic and worth looking at. So she runs something, as I said, she calls the Environmental Health Clinic, and it's based on health clinics at universities. The difference is that you come there with your environmental health concerns, and the suggestions for actions that you get are local, for instance, local data collection and urban interventions directed at understanding and improving your environmental health, plus referrals, not to medical specialists, but to specific art, design, and participatory projects, to local environmental organizations and local government and civil society groups. Organizations that can they can use the data and actions prescribed as forms of participation to promote social change. So in thinking about the role of the humanities, I've sort of increasingly become interested in the verbs, the way we talk about ourselves and describe ourselves, the operative verbs, if you want. And I mean, it's not only about the verbs, obviously, but it's how we think about ourselves and how we describe ourselves, which is a matter of discourse and not, what we actually do. But such texts, I think, have importance. So let's start with an authoritative and useful report, the Humanities World Report 2015, where the authors identify a set of answers to the question of the value of humanities research and what they call a plausible taxonomy of the most prominent attempts to articulate the value of the humanities around the world. I mean, there are problems with this report, I think, but it's useful in some ways. And they frame the humanities through categories such as having intrinsic value, benefiting society, informing social policy, understanding cultural heritage, promoting economic value, contributing to other disciplines, and promoting critical thinking and innovation. So if you look at the verbs, the set of verbs I just mentioned, could look something like this. Have, benefit, inform, understand, promote, contribute. I'm going to resort them briefly. And just to me that there is a kind of scale of something here, whether it's activity or intervention or agency. And I'm going to come back to this. And the point here is not that we're going to, in any world, going to want to remove understand, for instance. That's not the point. But looking at the repertoire and the way we think about ourselves and describe ourselves, that's what I'm after and what I'm interested in, really. And I think also that the point here is also that I think it's important to recruit I'm talking about humanistic knowledge now, and practices, recruit our criticality to think about what can and could be. And that's also, to actually be involved in different kinds of building. And this applies to infrastructure too. So let me use a couple of examples, 3 examples. As I said earlier, I'm interested in space. And this example is this is my part of my department at UCLA, information studies, as you mentioned, and a very bad drawing, but anyhow. So, I mean, at my department and elsewhere, there are lots of humanists and others who think about space and power and hierarchies and many other aspects of spatial configuration. So this is just a very simple example, but my my idea is to reconsider the institutional space in the department, to change the way the spatial configuration reinforces hierarchies and connect to the core operation of the department. And the basic idea is to take away, so faculty have windowed space around, and staff are centrally placed. So my suggestion is to let staff take some of the premium space with offices, because they're key to the operation and they spend much more time at the department than faculty do. And then thinking about, this is a kind of mock, it's not really mock, I'm going to do it, but I mean, it's an example anyhow. Think about what that would take in terms of sort of, if you think about this sort of more infrastructurally function. So as I said, staff tend to spend much more time at the department. As a department, we can have I'm incorporating you into this department now. As a department, we can have an ideology, saying, for instance, that we're committed to reinforcing hierarchies as little as possible, given the current structures. It's not good that they're going to disappear, especially not in the US. We can have a vision that says that staff-faculty collaboration is key to the success of the department, and that we'll be increasingly dependent on specialist staff. And we can see this as an opportunity to. Such a move might free up space for other types of infrastructure, including perhaps collaborative space and display technology or whatever. And then there are, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, a number of things we would have to consider in terms of architectural templates, material constraints, etc., etc. The way the university works institutionally to deal with these things. We'd have to have a process, of course, with dialogue, talking to people, thinking about the conceptual human foundation for such a move, and to frame this and plan it, etc., and implement. And I'm using this example because I think there's a tendency in the humanities often to look elsewhere in our sort of critical work. It's much easier to place that criticality in relation to science, technology, engineering, or to civic society than to look closely at ourselves. And I think that gaze or that criticality is important also for thinking about how we design things. So they come together, and that's one aspect or reason for using this example. I was also going to use another one which has to do with visualization. So I was involved in organizing a workshop on critical visualization at the Graduate Center in 2016, where we were interested in looking at visualization and in particular data visualization critically, as well as considering how we could engage constructively with visualization. And this is a major challenge. You're probably familiar with this, but as Joanna Drucker and others have pointed out, visualization is laden in different ways and subjective. And she says that I'm suggesting that we rethink the foundation of the way data are conceived by shifting its terms from certainty to ambiguity and find graphical means of expressing interpretive complexity. And as we know from archival work, also, some perspectives never get heard or enacted or are suppressed because the data structures and the visualization do not suggest such perspectives or views. So Drucker argues that although we have a sense of this criticality, we get seduced by the technology and the visualization. So she says, we know this, but we seem ready and eager to suspend critical judgment in a rush of visualization. And I see this if you're working in digital domains and the humanities, I think we see a lot of this in relation to use of Google Maps, network diagrams, and different kinds of visualizations, for instance. So we want to engage with visualization. I mean, one thing is the critical reading, which we did in this workshop, but also thinking about how something like what I just mentioned from Johanna in terms of engaging in terms of production and thinking about how we can, for instance, think about uncertainty, because these graphs often suppose these things are certain, and that there are data points. How do we do it? I mean, this is one of the what I'm more interested in terms of making. And one example is Catherine D'Ignazio's work on feminist data visualization. This is a great, it's actually a blog post, but I think it's good in that it's suggestive about what we might want to do. She talks about, as you can see here, about responsible representation, situating data visualization, how can we talk back to the data, question the facts, present alternative views and realities. And we can see an emerging literature around these kinds of questions. But it's difficult. I think my experience from working in HUMlab is that this is it's challenging to think about what kind of tools we could make that incorporate humanistic criticality and interpretation in a meaningful way. I mean, it's not based on the technology or the availability of the tool. It's a combination of research questions, challenges, things we're curious about, and different kinds of technological infrastructure or tools or whatever. And in some cases, we may have to make them because they're not there. So we're all embedded, for instance, talking about PowerPoint in a. I mean, you probably do. I think many people don't. I mean, think about the way that something like PowerPoint really influences the way that we make and articulate humanities research, and the way that the single slide at a time, centrally up front in the room, and the associated infrastructure really condition in some ways, or suggest very particular ways of engaging, exactly like this space does in its material configuration. So this is an example of one part of the lab. So one model of visualization that we could probably have gone for would have been an immersive environment where you may have seen them, where you have screens around. Essentially, you walk into space where you have every wall, ceiling, and floor are screens, and you have goggles or something on, and you engage in this space. We were more interested in having many screens, having a space where there is a seminar table at the center for conversation, but where we think about, I mean, in relation to the humanities as being interested in, or many in the humanities being interested in rich historical and cultural contexts, actually thinking about what it might mean to have a differently configured space with screens peripherally placed, as in this example here. So this is kind of experimental setup, if you want. And we actually built it and I'm just going to show you a few examples. This is Cecilia Linde engaging with an archive, which is part of this is an old project, but it's a project to research interested in Virgin Mary as a role model in medieval Sweden. So and they've collected a rich material from churches primarily, but the idea is that most modern digital archives present these kinds of materials as, partly, decontextualized, but also in a print kind of logic. So Cecilia's interested in a pre-modern, pre-print notion of the archive, which is experientially based, which is about actually touching things, moving in the space, etc., and using infrastructure to enact that. As an example of a project, as a use of space. So, this is a little bit dark, but this is a kind of performative space where there is a lot of experimentation too, and which is also linked. This is actually from the PowerPoint article, which is also linked to production of traditional scholarship, and in this case also building of software. So, as you may know, PowerPoint doesn't really scale to environments where you have more than one screen, for instance. It doesn't. Its logic is single screens, one slide at a time. So we built software to allow narratives or making narratives in this kind of infrastructure. So, and this is linked to another, practical example too. What I'm talking about here is also ways that we can sometimes make small changes in the way, in practices and in infrastructure that are linked to our research or ideas about what we want to be. I've done a lot of experimentation with what I call academic events. I mean, conferences, workshops, etc., etc. This is a fantastic book by the anthropologist Margaret Mead on the small conference. It's a little bit light here, I think, but I think you get the sense there. And there's, of course, even if we may not think about that always a whole lot, academic events are also part of the infrastructure of the humanities, and they have all kinds of conditioning built into them. I mean, they're about socializing, job searching, building one's academic persona, etc. So such events, including seminars, poster sessions, conferences, workshops, etc., are structured through programming and the use of space, and choices are made in terms of scholarly themes, reviewers, reviewer criteria, keynote speakers, attendance fees, and many other factors that include and exclude people and perspectives. So how can we work with something like that if we're interested in tweaking or changing or breaking some of that down? We've done some very, very small things. One is that I've personally, this is an example, I've stopped introducing people, stopped providing bios for people at events. It's a very small thing, but normally the senior scholar would have a much longer CV and a longer presentation, and it's not like you remove the hierarchies or the structures by doing that, but at least you don't sort of reinforce them or enact them. So especially if you mix two, so you try not. One of the things we also try to do is to perhaps not get rid of keynote speakers. But I've tried to reduce time often, and also not have, if you have a panel, close the session with the keynote speaker, not to necessarily make the panel be a comment on the keynote, but be individual contributions, perhaps in relation to a theme. These are ways of sort of engaging with the conference as a mode of knowledge production, and I have two more examples here. This is from UCLA. So if we're interested in conversation, and if the humanities are about conversations, which I believe, then the traditional seminar format, like this one, where I'm standing up here, you're there, you're silent most of the time, and expected to be. And where media, the presentation medium plays an important role, I think there are ways we can think about doing this differently. So what we try to do, this is again, it's experimental. The UCLA, the Humanities Seminar is based on the premise that, as I said, conversations, but also bringing people together around the theme, a little bit like a panel. So we have two-hour sessions, and each participant is allowed one medium. This is like dictatorship, so no PowerPoints. And it's a simple thing, but this happened that someone has insisted on bringing up a PowerPoint, and it really it immediately changes the format. It's interesting because the way that you engage with that material and you talk about it. So we do this. This is an example. This is the first one actually on encoding diversity, which it's a challenging kind of format too. It's a 2-hour conversation. That's one example. The other one you see here is about setting up pairs of people, pair conversations. Again, conversational, not not PowerPoints, but also playing with the idea of time. So as a speaker here, I've been given a certain amount of time, and that's something I'll guard with my life, probably, and you'll intervene if I go on too long. But the idea that if you do a batch of these conversations, where there is a lot of time for conversation between the two, but also with the people present, the idea that some of these things take off, some of these conversations take off, and others don't, and the ones and then allowing the ones that take off to take more time, and the ones that don't get less time. It's a simple thing, but also sort of challenging. But building a format that supports this has been one thing we've experimented with recently at UCLA. I have one more example. See if you're familiar with this one. So application systems or platforms for submitting proposals. So this is one you might be familiar with. You can do critical readings on these. They have a very strong administrative slant. They're obviously a tool for the funding agency. But the categorizations and standards that underlie such systems carry meaning and reflect basic assumptions about research. what counts and what doesn't count, credentialing, ontologies of disciplines. Some of you probably have difficulties filling in making the right choice up there. And if your products are more installations or something rather than publications, they don't fit as easily. I became interested in this when I used another platform, RJ's, Riksbankens jubileumsfonds platform, which I was so interested in both actually using the system, but also the way that it's described here, because as you probably know, I think most of you might have used it, RJ's system only includes ASCII text. Not even italics can be used, and I'm a linguist. Italics is really useful sometimes, and interestingly here too. So they say things that you can't use, but if you're using formulas, then they suggest you contact a project officer, but not if you need italics or images or something different. To me, there's something about this, because these are administrative systems, but they're also necessarily about scholarship and knowledge production. So not only does the administrative template shape the categorization and understanding of research proposals, but the expressive capacity of such systems, I think, suggests certain modes of engagement. So what I'm suggesting here is that maybe we could rethink this. Maybe we can do it differently. So if we believe that scholarly expressions manifest ideas and are epistemic, and that such ideas are shaped by the available expressive repertoire, it's questionable to have a system that only allows plain text. So what about multiple modalities, figural depictions of research challenges, visual mock-ups, direct links to data sources, etc., etc. So I've been thinking, because I've been looking at academic publishing, which is generally seen as a very problematic area and needs lots of change. Kathleen Fitzpatrick, among others, have written about that. But what if we got RJ, and we have someone from the board here, and Volkswagen Stiftung and NEH in the US, to commit to a project where they reformed these systems and made them for the humanities with a mind towards thinking about what kind of scholarly expressions we might be interested in using, and also sort of looking ahead, using in the future. And that would send a very strong signal, I think, to reviewers who would probably be very upset about it because it would be more challenging, to people who apply for funding, and to universities. It's again a kind of semi-mock example, but think about how we can actually sort of connect critical readings to doing intervention or making things. And I think we can actually, together or in some other constellation, design such a system. So design is also a verb, and I put this online, so some of you might have seen this. I did kind of look. I looked a little bit at how the humanities are being described by Swedish universities. I looked at the old universities, since you're not even, well, you're a university, but not even, it's not January 1st yet, you're not included there. And I don't know if you have any English-only speakers here, but I have a link on my website with Google Translate English version 2. And I don't know quite how to do this. I was planning to ask someone to read it, actually at the research meeting we had yesterday, but it went, it was 1.5 hours too long anyhow, so I didn't want to trouble them. And then I thought that I might ask people on the train going here this morning, but everyone looked so busy, because that's about modalities again, and I've done this experimentally before to actually have it being read. But I'm just going to show you this. You get a sense of it. And they're fairly similar in some ways. And but the universities are different too. I mean, det kan vara, and I'll read some of these in Swedish then. Det kan vara stora som små, smala eller breda, komplexa och ibland rent av obekväma. Det spelar ingen roll. Humanistiska fakulteten är platsen för de viktiga frågorna. Här utforskar du verkligheten och det fotspår vi människor lämnar efter oss. Vi ägnar oss till att vi förstår hur människor tänker och handlar både i vår egen tid och i den nära och avlägsna historien. I en värld där intrycken ökar i takt med samhällstempot är det viktigt att kunna resonera och diskutera utifrån humanistiska värderingar. Utbildning och forskning inom humaniora och samhällsvetenskap syftar till att förstå och beskriva hur människors föreställningar och kunskaper formas över tid, sociala och kulturella faktorer i människors beteenden, framväxten av samhället och orsaker och verkan av människors agerande och organisation. Humanistiska studier ger dig många kompetenser såsom analytisk förmåga, kritiskt tänkande och kulturell förståelse. And Linköping is a little bit more difficult because of the way that Linköping is organized. So I used a couple of different sources there. Det rör sig om hela registret. Reflektera, kommunicera, gestalta. Allt ifrån kommunikation på en rad olika språk till gestaltning i olika material. Then I also looked at the Swedish Research Council. And they say that forskning inom humaniora och samhällsvetenskap handlar om hur samhället fungerar och om hur kulturella värden skapas och sprids. I'd like to ask you actually, how many think that this is a good description of, humanities and social sciences? I assume that the second part is the humanities bit here. Om hur kulturella värden skapas och sprids. I don't know if there's any. I think it's just a sentence. And it's just, a kind of description. But it is the main introduction to the humanities on the Swedish Research Council website. So because I didn't ask people to read these texts, I wrote an email instead to Kerstin Salin, who's the head of Humanities Social Sciences at VR. And I quoted this and I said, I realize this has probably been here some time. Isn't it possible to have another kind of rendering of what this actually is? And she responded. And she said that she agreed. And she's asked someone now to look at this and they have another bit of text they're going to use. And then we can look at that instead. And then HUMtank, which is a more a newer kind of description, as you can see here. And it also says there in the same context that humanistisk forskning fokuserar på människan som social och kulturell varelse, hennes språkliga, konstnärliga uttryck och hennes relation till tillvaron runt omkring oss. So very quick observations here. So the verbs we find, or I found, is verbs like understand, explore, reason, discuss, describe. It's also about analytical ability, critical thinking, reflecting, communicating, manifesting or depicting, study, question, and here also tackle, I guess. And so these are more active verbs that we find on this page. But I still think if we look at this, and this is part of the information material, I still think it's, to me it seems a little bit tame. I don't know if you agree, or perhaps it's just my conception of the human. I think this is good, and it's sort of looking towards the future, etc. But I still think it's not about change. It's not about being directly engaged in societal change, for instance. And the question is, depends on how you read it, of course. And the question is whether that's something we're interested in or not. And it also depends on the precision of the last sentence here, I think, because maybe it's embedded in that. I have more to say about that. I think I'll skip that for now. Apart from pointing out that apart from the examples from this slide I mentioned, there are also a couple of other sort of more active verbs, or actually not verbs, but constructions like obekväma problem in the Gothenburg one. They also talked about de viktiga frågorna. And the Linköping side talks about skarpa kulturella analyser och djärvt kritiskt tänkande. So make that point. And then move on to looking at sort of what I would call progressive, perhaps, humanities-oriented initiatives interested in change or writing. So these are just 3 examples. One from here, one from Irvine, and also David P. Goldberg's book on the afterlife of the humanities. And again, I'm just looking at the mostly a few phrases or verbs here: articulating, debating, thinking, discussing, considering, inquiry, and thinking. All these are super important things, of course. But I also think that looking at the network here, for instance, so it'll do so through refining participatory processes in which the alternative futures can be articulated and debated. I think to me, I mean, I certainly, knowing a little bit about the group and having seen the work too, I think there's also a capacity here, and this is just suggesting a capacity here to do more than articulating and debating. And I've tried to include a few, not alternatives in relation to these, but just other kinds of verbs. And I've been collecting these too. I have a larger collection, sort of, because if you look at the other Swedish Research Council descriptions of the other areas, all of them naturally include kind of interventions or connections to changing things in society. And I think that's something we can do if we want to, if it makes sense. And if we're thinking about futures and future making, I think we do have the capacity even to be involved in building things physically together with others. And you know, we might want to maintain a kind of distance or not. I'm just suggesting that it's worth thinking about. So this is about framing. And framing is something you never do, or very rarely do, separate from the world. So I was just going to quickly use these examples to. I mean, humanities are always in a threatened position, of course. So this is a recent example. I like Ida's Östenberg's comment here that she'll started off with complaining about the title of the seminar. But there's a notion here of the humanities that you know, we might find problematic, perhaps, or not. NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities in the US, were threatened to be closed down by Trump, or the Trump administration, and this is their response to that, or one of the responses to that. And they were successful in that they were actually funded for next year, but it's a precarious situation, of course. But the point I want to make here is that there is what happens is that you in that kind of very defensive position, and this is real stuff. I mean, the chair of NEH stepped down, the day after this or whatever. But there is a tendency to go for the things that we think, like with Volvo Trucks, the things we think that they want. And that's why these kinds of projects are listed, especially the military ones. I mean, in the statutes of NEH, the first point there is to support high-quality research, etc. But that's not really visible here. And I see why, but I'm just saying that these kinds of constructions are important. And you may have seen this Kunskapens nya rörelse, this report, supported by 3 Swedish funding agencies. And here, I think we see the same kind of pattern. I'll do it like this. This is a suggestion for how to move forward with the humanities, thinking about infrastructure and communication. It starts off by being very much connected to knowledge exchange, samverkan, etc. But it ends up being an infrastructure for the production and delivery of knowledge in the humanities. And I'll do this very quick. So what happens is that the humanities gets construed, I think, as communication and collaboration. There's a separation of communication and scholarship. It's also often a very one-sided sense of collaboration. Often it's humanities stepping out into the world and telling the world what it needs to know, rather than, and it's very rarely also about the humanities changing. It's very often about the world changing. In most of these descriptions, the humanities are static, or fairly static, described as fairly static. But in many of them, there is a discourse of the world changing, and that's one reason why we need to think about these things. So I don't know how I'm doing on time. I have a little bit time left. Yeah, okay, fine. So I just wanted to say something as a kind of, bye, Lena. To connect this briefly to infrastructure, because this is an infrastructural argument partly in this report. And I mean, there's been an infrastructure turn from the 1980s relating to civic infrastructure, the idea that roads, different kinds of infrastructures were breaking down, in particular starting in the US, I guess, in the 1980s, a discourse of and policymaking about academic infrastructure from the late 1990s, the idea that, research infrastructure. And this is an example of one kind of consequence of this infrastructure logic, or if you want. So we now have roadmaps for infrastructure. The roadmaps are an important building block, and this extends in here from the European level roadmaps down to, I mean, at Umeå we have a humanities group for infrastructure, research infrastructure, and increasingly the humanities have been asked to be involved in these things, often in very marginalized positions. There is a great example from an OECD report that says that, talk about road mapping, and that, one challenge is that it can become victim to its own success when increasing number of scientific domains are included in large interdisciplinary roadmaps, extending to the social and behavioral sciences, and even the humanities. So the humanities is not kind of core for this kind of thing. It's an STS, science, technology, it's a STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics kind of model. And these, infrastructure thinking is a kind of infrastructural regime. There are lots of things assumed, and lots of things that are important. And I won't go through this in detail because I don't have time, but it's about standards, interoperability. It's about the global, not the local. It's about costly big thing. European spallation source is a good example. And I think as humanists, we should resist most of these, or we can resist them if we think that makes sense. We don't have to buy into the to the model, and we can be involved in shaping these things. The problem is that we're very bad, I think, for different reasons, being involved in that kind of shaping. This is an example from the US. So this is the science model of infrastructure, and this is a humanities report on cyber infrastructure. And if you read it, if you look at it briefly, you'll see that it's essentially a copy of the STEM model, but it says that the tools will be the same, but only up to the point where the nature of the data begins to shape the nature of the tools, which I think most of us, or many of us, would think is very, very early. It's a very problematic statement. So most of this kind of discourse, infrastructure discourse, is utterly free of epistemic, critical, and societal inflection. So I looked at 3 of these humanistic or humanities infrastructure reports, and I didn't find any references to gender or to race or to labor. Categories that are important to us, as many of us as humanists. And the models are typically, or very often, tool-based, tool access, or sometimes, like in the report I just talked about, public engagement. So the question, this is an recent Australian roadmap. So this is the bit about the humanities. And of course this has to do with the people involved and the disciplines involved in shaping humanities infrastructure speak. So I'm interested in thinking about how we can expand the kind of footprint of humanistic infrastructure. And this is kind of opportunity, because infrastructure isn't just stuff, technology. Infrastructure can be all kinds of things. And we can be involved, I think, in tweaking, changing, and sort of making up what infrastructure is too. And the one question is this the best we can do? Most infrastructure, I don't know if you've read any of these reports or this kind of language, is just not very interesting, I find, even though I'm familiar with these kinds of standards, etc., and I realize the importance of them. So let's wrap this up then, briefly. I just wanted to use this example too, and some of you were there, I think. So in the policy document from government, there is a mention of data-driven research as something in the humanities, is something they might want to invest in. And we did Pelle Snickars and I, together with others, did a workshop at KTH mid-September. And this is an example of doing this, a little bit of this shaping. So we had a program which was, I think, entirely or to a very large degree driven by humanistic research questions, rather than starting out from the technology. And this is policy making, but actually I think can be part of sort of changing the territory. So again, just to sum up, I think to talk about verbs again, we need to use many verbs to have a broad repertoire. And I've gestured towards the active and interventionist part of that repertoire, because I think we need to be there too. So this is a matter of scholarly advancement, developing our infrastructure, and taking place as humanists, but also engaging with the future where humanistic leadership will be central, I think, taking on many of the major challenges in the world. And this is not something, I think this is a more common statement from outside the humanities than from inside. And I think universities, this requires critiquing, challenging, imagining, and building, among other things. And universities, I think, can be an important platform for such works, but it extends much further too. So this is about civic engagement and making change. This is Natalie Gergiamenko again. So such work might require us to reimagine and redesigning our relationship to natural systems to improve human and environmental health. And again, this is partly a matter of active framing. So Natalie will say, when she sees Tesla with a zero emission kind of vision, she'll say, can't they do better than that? Because she's interested in things that improve rather than to decrease the kind of damage. It's a different way of thinking. It's a narrative. It's a model. Things that many humanists are interested in. And finally, too, like such work must operate on multiple scales and levels. And it's not I'm not arguing that it's a fully blown social justice and civil rights project, but at some level it's all about what Angela Davis speaks about, using knowledge as a way to remake the world and to make it better for all its inhabitants, which requires having a critical posture towards the world and also be critical towards the tools we use to effect change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patrik, for this wonderful intro to the humanities in a different way. We're open for discussions here and questions for the floor, but first I would like to introduce Petra Ragnestam to the stage. And Petra has going to start as a discussion, being a senior lecturer in English studies here, but also the local representative of the HUMlab network.
Well, so for me this is quite interesting, and I agree very much in a lot of the thoughts and the things you have been discussing here. And as a representative of HUMlab, this is quite a lot of the discussions going on there. We're talking very much about the new humanities. How can we re-envision what and how humanities can act? Agreeing with you then, with a lot of things, I still think we need to discuss some of the sort of more pedestrian stuff. So, I mean, how do you think the interventionist or activist kind of humanities you've been talking about, how does that relate to this kind of buzzwords, which I think a lot of humanities people are thinking about right now, like samverkan in Swedish, I don't know, collaboration or innovation is another such word, which I think is very much also in line with this, but perhaps not parallel with it, if you see what I mean. So, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's very, as you said too, I think it's very much connected to that. That's another kind of frame, to that kind of policy or discourse making. It's another kind of framework too. And I think similarly there, I think we can, if we want to, we can be involved in sort of changing the parameters for those discussions as well. And I've done a fair bit of work with earlier with Vinnova, for instance, and trying to stress the things that we thought were important from the humanities side of things. I also think that you could imagine suggesting to Vinnova, for instance, that let's try to approach some of these so-called global challenges, or the breda samhällsutmaningar, as the government puts it. Let's bring together, a group of people so the humanities are taking the leadership role in addressing problems that haven't been successfully in any way dealt with. So I think there's a lot of space there, and I think if I can just add to, some of the examples here were let's say the academic events and the infrastructure we built at HUMlab. We created the tools to do it, and we started the company to capitalize on some of these ideas connected to what we did in the lab. So that's a very sort of close connection to innovation. We work with industry, especially media companies. I think we can change what samverkan. Samverkan, I think, has to be many different things, and all the things that we like to do and that are important to us as humanists. But I think we can extend the repertoire there. Because
I think that's kind of interesting. Because I told you we had this meeting with Vinnova and Forte and HUMsamverkan, which is a way of trying to bridge, I suppose, the idea of innovation with what humanists are doing. But it seems very difficult to make it happen from both parties, if you see what I mean. So the question is what we need to do to actually, because it was very apparent from both of the men who were there from Vinnova and Forte that they had structures that were very much enclosed and not very open for an understanding of the humanities. And the humanists had a very sort of limited understanding of what they could actually do in those kinds of collaborations. So, what is actually, now I'm talking perhaps infrastructure. I mean, what is actually needed? Is it from us or is it from everybody?
I think it's from both or everybody, or perhaps it's about having functions or places or zones or whatever where some of this kind of work can be intermediated, where you don't have to do everything yourself. I mean, all these models, I mean, innovation models, etc., are typically serialized, sort of technology-based models. So HUMtank perhaps could envision a model that was based on different kinds of premises, but then you would, you know, and this is, I think, probably work with, you know, people from industry, etc. I think but it's similar to infrastructure in the way that it's very sort of, there is really a template for doing, but I do think it's possible to suggest alternative ways at looking. I'm not saying it's easy because it isn't, and probably also sort of aggregating. I mean, like having different organizations or people come together to do that kind of work. And some of it isn't so interesting, perhaps. That's another thing, you know.
I think, but I think it is. But I think there is a problem of some kind of interaction in this. I read this report called from Arts Humanities Research Council called Arts Humanities Research Innovation, and they were talking about intermediaries that would be necessary for this actually to work. And I was wondering, who could that intermediary be? You know?
I mean, I think it can be many different things. Probably for us, I mean, drawing on my own experience, I mean, HUMlab was a platform like that. Yeah. Because it had. I mean, I'm talking about HUMlab during my tenure. I can't talk about it from when I stepped down. That's not my responsibility. But the idea that having a place where you have those kinds of discussions, but also where people come to because they're interested in dialogue, and I think it's also a matter of I mentioned that word earlier, curatorship. I mean the putting together of those kinds of contexts. I mean, there is maybe one thing we could do together would be to approach Vinnova and say that, look at these challenges. We think there are other ways of approaching them together with industry, and we've talked to these guys in industry and men and women, and we have someone. There's a colleague at Arizona State, Gary Dirks, who used to be executive for BP in Asia and China, and he'll say that this requires humanities leadership, and he's very convincing, especially because it worked 30 years as a CEO. You can set up a kind of situation, and then I think you have to think about ways of instrumentalizing that. What would it take? Well, it would take investments from Vinnova, and they have lots of funding, but that doesn't make it easy. But you could, let's say, put together a 5-year program. And suggest allocating, build a structure. But I think you have to do that kind of framing partly, and perhaps with help, depending.
Because it seems that some of it is actually, you were talking about words. And
it
discourse,
is.
and there's a gap between what people understand some of the words to mean, like innovation. Yeah. What is the relation between innovation or creativity or some words like that, exploration, experimentation, things like that, with a lot of humanists would recognize, but they would perhaps not recognize the word innovation.
No, and I think too that I agree that exactly what you're saying, that the thinking about how we can, I mean, it doesn't work if you can't be at too much a distance. You need to engage, obviously, in conversation, and you need also, I think, to engage with the structures that are there in some way or another. But that doesn't make them like. I think. I mean, Angela Davis is an icon. I wouldn't even. That's a totally different kind of work and world. But what she talks about is how you actually change some of those, and you have the idea that you can change the structures too, and doing that kind of work. I mean, you saw the picture from HUMlab earlier. It's buying into some of the even aesthetics, but with the kind of precise. I mean, choices we made to do that. But it is a kind of environment that works, I think, for those kinds of engagement. It's not the humanistic department hallway.
No.
So the exact way you set up these things too.
So what is actually needed is that it shouldn't be a simulation of either parties, but a kind of a separation in conversation, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, the danger is that somebody simulates into somebody else.
Yeah. No, I agree.
No,
I agree. I mean, I don't think that's the goal, and I think recruiting help from, I mean, HUMtank could do that.
Yeah.
That's a platform. HUMtank is an infrastructure and platform. So you get 5 vice chancellors together, and I mean, this is just a suggestion.
Yeah.
And you have a couple of like CEOs for companies and a couple of entrepreneurs, early stage entrepreneurs, and then you build something. You start to invite. Maybe the minister of I think you. And one thing I've been thinking about, just as a very quick example, is I'd love to be involved in creating an infrastructure engineering program based on, engineering, but also based on the kinds of things I've been talking about, the humanistic, etc. Not as a kind of something you sprinkle on top, but something that's integrated. And I would ask the departementet, for things like that. And you could, because HUMtank is a good platform.
And I think it's also important to open up with people like the stakeholders, to think of them also in diverse ways. We don't only have companies in business. We also have different kinds of organization. We have like public venues, we have non-profit organizations and stuff like that, which is also interesting that they're not very often mentioned as part of the development of society or the idea of the general good of society. It's always the economic stakeholders that are discussed, So maybe it's also a good way of opening up, of discussing different people to work with.
Yeah, and it's not only one, as I said, it's not only one type of humanity.
No.
I think it's very important to be inclusive in that sense too.
And also then perhaps having businesses and those stakeholders and researchers.
I think businesses get this.
Yeah.
I think they do. If you get them in the same space.
Another question, which sounds perhaps a bit vague or stupid. The kind of activist, and this is I don't know if this is possible to answer. So what would you say is activist? Is conversation activist or interventionist? I'm also back to the idea of the public intellectual.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? What is actually part of this? How would you envision different kinds of activist approaches?
I think it's
too big.
Well, it's a good question. I think it's I don't know if it's a scale, probably not, but some kind of something you could maybe try to visualize if you were into, on a piece of paper or something. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't exclude that. Certainly not. And for me, I'm not I'm a moderate activist, if anything. But to me, it's about resisting, for good reasons, resisting structures that are there. So and that can be the small things I mentioned with, like the conference examples in the kind of knowledge context. But increasingly, especially when I've been in the US now, this is just a personal kind of experience too. Thinking about much more about different kinds of societal questions. And much of that is about dialogue. The seminars we had at the Graduate Center, the very first seminar was with Naomi Murakawa from Princeton, who talked about procedural justice and race. In the US, how there is a kind of procedure for police when they approach people they might want to arrest. So they do certain things. They make sure that if they arrest someone, they talk to the mother, and they have, and they have a protocol they follow, and they're supposed to express empathy. Those kinds of things. And Naomi says, I don't believe in empathy. But that was but it was a packed room. It was very diverse. It was a very heated discussion. And I think those kinds of moments actually change things. So in a sense, I mean, they are interventionistic. And afterwards, there was this guy, a black guy, who said, you know, about guns. He said, "I have a gun. I need my gun." And the head of the institute said, was very. It was almost an aggressive situation there, but he explained, you know, why. And the director said, you know, if your SWAT team comes, that won't help you. And this young guy said, "Well, I know that. I've been in that situation. I didn't use my gun then." And there is something about those conversations that make you think about, and with Natalie's work too, thinking about sort of environmental change. And in the US, it's very real, some of these things too. I mean, my neighbor she works for an NGO, for one of these, and she deals with homelessness. And not only homelessness, the kind of traditional homeless community, but with students. So every 10% of the students at UCLA don't have anywhere to live. So that's a fact. So we're hoping to do something, actually conversation in the spring. I'm going to invite Angela Davis too, see if it works out.
Yeah, so what we need to do also in humanities is to rethink the idea of utility, or the way, in what ways can we discuss usefulness rather than rather than nytta in this very sort of Swedish, very narrow idea of what societal usefulness should be.
I think there are basic humanistic practices that can be very useful in a deep sense to approaching some of these big questions, and that are also highly relevant from connected to scholarship and scholarly aspirations too. They have to be both, I think.
And of course, there is a lot of work done for the humanists themselves to rethink their own positions in relation to a lot of these words or discourses. Thank you. It's very, very interesting talk.
Yeah, and and I would love to be. I've met the HUMtank people, of course, in different contexts, but I would love to be helpful if there's interest. Just a conversation or something.
Yeah, because it's changed. We're now 15 university, I think, and quite a lot of them are new. So a good bridge with the old HUMtank, I think, is a good idea, actually. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, questions from the floor? And we're recording it, that's why it's good to use the microphone.
Okay, thank you. Marcin Poprawski, I'm a guest from University in Poznan in Poland. I would like to address 2 points, if I may. One is a short question, the second is a kind of observation. The question, among the fields within humanities, we have such a thing like a management as humanity, which is even classified in some kind of categories. I think OECD also got that. So we have management as economical science and management as humanities, which also could contain the aesthetics in organizations and cultural issues in organizations, etc., etc. So from your observation in the US, would you say that this kind of field within the humanities could have a kind of impact, or could have a kind of new role today, if we need that kind of components? If we need ethics in management, maybe you should ask philosophers who are in management studies. Is that a kind of chance to have significant role as humanities in the sciences? So that's my question. And maybe just a comment. I got such a feeling that today there is a kind of inequality between the technology people and humanists, in a way that I would say the dialogue is, I think a lot of humanists feel like a clients of a technology people and not partners. And what I observed in some conversation I have recently with people from art museums in Poland, we have got an idea of having a conference for museum directors of museum who did a kind of narrative museum, so telling stories, and they basically use technology there. So we wanted to have a conference like heritage, imagination, senses, and technology. And several directors said, no, we don't want technology in title, please. Let's use tools. Because they feel that they have a lot of experiences of technology people being very cynical in cooperating with humanities or with the arts, proposing the technology that is already gone. I mean, that's in 5-6 years there will be no need of this technology. So they are just selling already products to museums, to art museums or to narrative museums, and not really getting into partnerships. So they were very skeptical about their role as only clients, as humanists being a clients of technology people. So, but maybe you have quite a positive examples that will negate my reflections on cynical rather relation between technology people and humanists. So
I wouldn't do that. They probably have good reasons, but I think again we need to have. I mean, it's useful to have platforms where you have these kinds of meetings happen. Because I know for a fact, I mean, that there are lots of technologists that are interested in the kind of questions that are important to the humanities. I think it's a very strong, you mentioned tools, it's a very strong tool, access-based model, and certain tools that are propagated, I mean, for commercial and other standardized reasons. I think we have to, I said resist the napkins there. I think we have to resist some of those too, but then we also need to have the people to do it. And again, I think perhaps digital humanities can be such a platform, but I mean, it isn't really right now because it's also tuned into the kind of tool paradigm. I think one way of doing it, I think, is to think about what we can, when need be at least, think about the kinds of things we need and engage in conversation from that standpoint. And I think often that's really interesting also to the technology side. I mean, not off-the-shelf stuff, but stuff that uncertainty is super interesting, I think, for many computer science folks, for instance, and that's something that we often deal with in the humanities. About organization or management and organizational theory, I don't know. I mean, you're talking about the placement. For me, humanities is kind of fairly inclusive. I certainly think that organizational theory and management theory is part of, or really useful for the kind of stuff I'm talking about. I mean, looking at institutions, for instance, organizational theory, yes.
Okay, other questions?
Hi, I come from the humanities, and when I look at humanities research, some of it is not very good. It's quite normative, it can be really conservative, and even backward-looking. So, do you have any experiences or do you have any reflections on what might be the negative effects of having this kind of research inserted into, I don't know, fields of technology? Or, if not negative, at least challenges of combining humanities with technology? Just as we know that not all dialogues are good dialogues. What would be the sort of challenges of that?
I guess part of your question is about, or in relation to the, I mean, you're talking about the quality of humanistic.
Not only that, but more in general, is it always good to insert humanities into these kind of questions?
I think it's no. I don't think it's always good, but I think it's good to have conversations and also to, I mean, engage where you think it's important to engage, which isn't everywhere. I think it should be. I mean, ideally, curiosity, both curiosity-driven, but also in relation to. I mean, if you want to engage with some of the, we talked about these kind of grand challenges, it will have to be based on people who have that interest and have relevant research to feed into those processes. I don't believe in inserting technology either everywhere. I mean, it's not, often we didn't use the technology in the lab. I mean, it was more important to get people together, but there is certainly uses, and I mean, obviously, but also thinking about how technology can be a place for criticality. I think also in the sense of building things.
Yeah, just can be a place of criticality. Isn't necessarily one. But you don't have any experiences of nothing happening when you
Yeah,
have,
yeah.
or even downright, negative experiences of that combinations?
Yeah, I mean, if you run a lab like HUMlab for many years, I mean, this is about engagement over time, and lots of things that don't work out, and lots of collaborations that don't work out either. I don't think it's directly connected to the quality of the research or whatever, but it's things that attempts at engagement which for different reasons never sort of materialize, or where it doesn't lead anywhere. I think one challenge is that to be too much in the framework of these tools, for instance. It's hard work to be in the kind of spot. It's difficult to be both, critical and to be involved in building the tools at the same time, for instance. So many things don't work out. And I think that's part of the model probably too. Hi.
From a background of IT, new media, and limited research, artistic research, I would like to bring in another aspect, and namely with regard to technology, whether it is technology for profit, such as the big institutions, companies have, or whether it is open source technology and free source. From my experience, there is a big difference when technology is being used as a tool, as instrument to reach societal change, which I have seen happening when you make it available to everyone, in a sense that it is for free, so you don't pay, and everyone has the right to come and code with you and develop, Fab Lab and so on. And when IBM or Microsoft, one of the big companies, they come to do some so-called innovative projects, is that just for the aim of innovating the business for the sake of more capital, which creates more distance in a gap between rich and poor, a distribution of power, capital, resources, knowledge, capitalizing ideas, as you said, versus disseminating knowledge openly, which would empower, emancipate society at a large.
That's good. That's a great comment and question too. I think in my experience or practice, I guess it's been both. But it's a very good point, because I think it's true of HUMlab too. Much of the energy too came from working with those kinds of communities. I mean, the open source community, working on large European projects where the results were, open access or available to people, and also working with groups like indie game developers. Many of those might have been in industry at the same time, working for a game company, but in the evenings they would be working on their individual, often more sort of art-influenced projects, and we try to, to some degree, to create an arena for them in the lab too. There's an enormous challenge, of course, with the large IT industry. We've seen so many examples over the last couple of months. I mean, there's one of my colleagues at UCLA in information studies works on the sort of Google algorithms, for instance. The way that race and models of race and gender are built into these platforms, etc. And even one imagine in those kinds of, you collaborate with Google. That's Sophia Noble, whose work she's coming out with a new book soon. One might wonder whether if you have a collaboration of some sort with Google, whether you could actually, to the degree you could actually change things. And maybe they would be perceptive or not. Talking about your point about working with like large IT industries, but there's an enormous focus in the US too on these open platforms. Certainly, that's important. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, even more, I'd say, to some degree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thomas Peterson, I'm from the Department of Computer Science and Media Technology here.
And we know each other.
Yeah, we do.
You had a space in the lab.
You know, yeah.
Office.
You remember, 15
Yeah,
years ago, you
course,
supported
yeah.
my PhD project. Yeah, that was great. Yeah, but so I have, but a bit apart from talking about the past, very interesting talk. You talk a lot about facing structures that are kind of against humanities in the society and trying to work around that or change those things. But I was thinking about, as I'm an interaction designer basically, even if I have a computer science background, and I was thinking about using humanities knowledge in interaction design processes. And of course, you're probably used to this in some regards, but I just wanted to point out that apart from changing society on the big scale, you know, addressing the big questions in the society, I, as an interaction designer, can definitely see how we could use humanist knowledge as part of interaction design processes to have better understanding of the outcome of what we are designing. In particular, we are usually designing interactive systems that will change how people behave. This is, in fact, usually the goal of our processes is to change people's behavior. And it's kind of ridiculous if we're doing this without having people on board that are supposed to know how human culture changes. You know, those are you guys. So I'm just talking critical against my own discipline in some regards, saying that probably we should have more humanists in the design processes. And the benefit of this would be that we are perhaps a bit better in predicting the changes that we see once our products are launched. You know, I'm talking about streamed music, wearable computers, persuasive technology that changes how people, you know, the means that are choosing in everyday life. All these things it's carried by technology, but the whole goal is actually to perform some kind of change. And I think pretty often humanists are not so engaged in the design processes, at least the ones I've kind of looked at. So I don't know, simply another perspective.
Yeah, no, I totally, I think that's an extremely important point, certainly, and maybe also thinking about how that process, what that process might look like. You know, if you take the the humanistic side, you know, seriously, I mean, to the degree to which that might change sort of, or even challenge basic presumptions behind a specific project, and the way, I mean, I think there's increasing interest, and has been for some time, I guess, in things like algorithmic studies, for instance. You know, looking at the way that the structures, the particular structures of databases, or the type of database you have, carries with it certain kinds of worldviews, etc. So I mean, I think that's really useful arena for doing work. And there's so much. I mean, one of my colleagues at UCLA, Todd Presner, has written about it's a very good article if you're interested on the ethics of the algorithm, I think it's called. He's doing work on the Shoah archive, Holocaust survivor video stories, but he's also reflecting about, this is not an industry project, but still reflecting about how the very database sort of structures the way that we look on in this case, at atrocities, because that's a model, if you want. And I mean, you were also, you were in the, I mean, that shows an interest in those kinds of exchanges from way back. Yes, please hire us. Maybe not the people in this room, well, not all of us, but. And there are new kinds of programs too to educate students, I think, for a different world.
It's me again, sorry.
Sure.
Just a final thing for me, because it connects to this. It also has something to do with the idea of knowledge production, I suppose, with how we're talking now about applied research with well-defined outcomes which you're talking about. We already know what we want the outcome to be, and of course this is very alien to a lot of humanists that think about their own research in those terms. So it's also, again, back to conversation, how to talk about different kinds of knowledge production and how they can actually meet in the research projects.
And to exactly, and the way you set that up, I think you have to be, I mean, if possible, to be, I don't know if generous is the right word, but to be sensitive to different kinds of traditions and perhaps also timelines. You know, maybe you can imagine a long-lasting humanities-based project that interfaces with, let's say, prototype development, you know, in a company or elsewhere, where that's not the only product, but can feed into the humanistic analysis or whatever.
Okay, anyone else? We have 5 minutes. Okay, one thing about we don't, here at K3, which is one part of the faculty organizing this, the research area is called the kind of clumsy NMOG, New Media, Public Spheres, New Forms of Expression. Is a way of talking about the tools we use, new media, the areas we work in with the public sphere, and the way we do things through new forms of expression. But we're also talking about if that's going to be made into something broader, discussing is maybe digital humanities the word to use or something like that. But I don't think we're going that way, because still there are the things when you talk about the humanities that digital humanities is a way of re-energizing it. Maybe HUMtank also says that, but it's still a way of keeping with the humanities, and it's a way of not challenging that, and it's also excluding people that are not coming from the humanities. So for us, in a way, that don't really need that word in that way, is that the other way around? I mean, to stop problematizing the humanities and using completely different concepts.
No, I think, I mean, I can see that it makes sense not to engage, you know, not to relabel or whatever yourselves or that platform as the humanities, certainly.
I think not just for the label to cross it, but
but in
the way of identity. If you learned, which some of you are here, I mean, that could be a more obviously a tradition you will want to identify yourself with, but
it's. I mean, as you may know, I mean, my sense of the humanities is a very broad sort of. I really see that the humanities is an opportunity for the kind of exchange I've been talking about, the kind of contact zone-ness, which is per definition invitational. So it's engaging with others. It's a kind of humanistic platform to do work that you might not be able to do otherwise. But of course, the humanities is many other things too, and I mean there is a very strong, computational tool-based instrumental text analytical kind of framework, which I'm not saying that is wrong or anything like that, but it's also been part of shaping the kind of infrastructure discourse I was talking about earlier. So, and it's also now, I mean, there are the humanities initiatives in many places. So, you know, the question is what's pragmatically useful. I think what we were talking about, and I do think that the humanities is a useful label too, but the humanities together with other things very often, as you were saying, other things and disciplines and perspectives.
Okay, before we finish, just let me say that we had a Medea Talk a couple of months ago by design professor Anne Light. That one is now online, so if you were not here, you can watch it on the webpage now, or if you want to revisit
tonight,
straight after. And you're all very welcome back here in 1 week's time, because then we're going to have Joanna Zielinska here, who's a professor of new media from Goldsmiths, London, but also an artist and curator and photographer. So she's going to talk about the end of man, which is a nice end of the term topic, I think.
I hope you survive till you become university.
Precisely, that's the last challenge.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for coming here. It was a very interesting and stimulating talk, and thank you all for taking part.